Up next, we have Kelly Nova from Piscines Ranch talking about regenerative wine growing, enhancing ecosystem health and profits by mimicking nature. For the past 25 years, Kelly has managed and consulted with vineyards, farms, and ranches throughout the Western US, Spain, Australia, and China. In 2012, he was sponsored by government and wine industry organizations to give presentations and workshops on extended season vineyard grazing throughout Australia and New Zealand. His studies include ecological horticulture at UC Santa Cruz, viticulture at UC Davis, and holistic management with Alan Savory. His work is focused on combining experience in farming and viticulture with holistic management in order to design and manage more ecologically, socially, and economically sound farming practices. This usually involves a considerable amount of help from livestock. Kelly is vineyard director of Piscines Ranch and does design and advising work for vineyards. Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. Please take it away.
Thanks. Making sure everybody can hear me.
We hear you fine.
Yes, you're
Thank
good.
you.
Okay, thanks. Just a brief overview of Piscines Ranch, where I'm at. We're south of Hollister, about 15 miles. This picture was taken during the dry season. Unfortunately, it doesn't look a lot different than that right now. But
Kelly, I'm sorry, we cannot see your screen. Would you please share your screen with your presentation?
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
How's that?
We're still not seeing anything.
I can share it for if you'd like, Kelly. This is William from Goldridge.
Yeah, please go ahead, Will.
Oh, looks like he's got it.
Okay, good. All right. So the ranch is 7,600 acres. 600 acres of that is irrigated cropland. Formerly, there was 1,000 acres of wine grapes on here. It was part of Almaden Vineyards back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Those vines have been gone since probably the mid to late 80s. We are doing part of the crop farming ourselves, and we're also doing a pretty large sheep operation. We have about 16 to 1,800 ewes that we're going to lamb out this year, starting here pretty soon. I've been here for about 6 years now working on this vineyard project that you guys are going to hear about. The first slide I'm going to show is actually from Dr. Jones. And I just wanted to show this. That was a really great presentation he did yesterday. And some of the things that he was recommending for the way forward. The thing that really hit me about Dr. Jones's presentation was that the reality of climate change, it seems to be coming at us faster than we thought. And we can't continue doing the same things we've been doing and expect to get a different result. We really need to start thinking about a different way going forward for managing. This is kind of the driving question that we have at Piscines Ranch, actually for all of our farming endeavors, but it started with our wine growing. And that is it possible to significantly increase ecosystem health while simultaneously maintaining or increasing profitability? Our premise is that in order to do that, we need to design and manage for effectively creating systems that take advantage of everything that's free. We have free nitrogen, we have free fertility, free sources of energy, and a number of things like that. And the way forward, we believe, is mimicking nature in order to tap into those. These are the principles that we use. These are basically taken from regenerative agriculture in general, although we've adapted them slightly for what we're doing here. And these are common throughout the world now, people practicing regenerative agriculture. First one is to keep the soil covered throughout the year with living vegetation or residue. And a lot of talk about that just finished with. Minimize soil disturbance, which is generally in the form of tillage, encourage diversity of plants, insects, soil biology, etc. And in particular, we're looking at how we encourage native diversity of life. Have living roots in the ground as much of the year as possible, living roots plants, which we have an unfair advantage of in California with basically a year-round growing season. Fifth one is integrate well-managed livestock. I'll be talking a lot about that. And 6 is avoid chemical, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, and mimic nature for creating your fertility. And the last one is work with people who are dedicated to the principles and practices of growing ecosystem health. If you try and work with somebody who doesn't believe in that, then it's really a time burner. So we try and select and work with people who really believe this is possible. The main principle that we're looking at is how do we take advantage of solar energy? And because really most of our agriculture now almost ignores the potential of solar energy, and that's our greatest energy source. And by that, I mean directly from the sun to the plants through photosynthesis, converting that energy into sugars and carbon that gets pumped down into the soils, which in turn stimulates microbes and which increases the soil fertility. So you basically have this energy cycle occurring. If you have bare ground, that can't happen. It's what is referred to as a solar spill. You've lost all the potential there. So really the main driver in all of this, and this is the main driver in life, in terrestrial life on the planet, is photosynthesis. And so how do we take advantage of that? I'm going to show a few examples of what's going on out there. Nothing will probably be new to anybody in this group, but if we think of this as like a solar panel, we're capturing almost nothing there. The problem is that when we do capture it, whether it's in conventional or organic systems, we tend to till that into the ground. After tilling a cover crop into the soil, we lose most of the carbon within a week. This is another example of probably an organic system, maybe a biodynamic system. Got a lot going for it here, but the ground is still being tilled. So from this perspective of carbon cycling, we're losing a lot of the potential there. In addition, we're also losing beneficial habitat for microorganisms. As another thing Dr. Jones mentioned yesterday was just the effect on soil temperature. The soil temperature on bare ground is a lot higher than on covered ground. And if you're a microbe, that protection is going to be really valuable. So what we're basically looking at working away from is the fossil fuel, monoculture, high input, and high tillage systems, which can occur in both organic conventional practices. And we want to get back, move more towards the solar system that is based off of sunlight and creative planning. I'm going to go through some of the ways in which we do that. I just mentioned the bare soil problem, and one of the big issues, especially for us here, we average 12 inches of rain. We're going to be lucky if we get 4 inches this year, is having the capacity to retain all the water that we do get. This is back to the idea of taking advantage of free resources. Rainfall is lost if we have bare ground and it runs off or just evaporates back into the air. So a thing of primary importance for us is to sequester carbon and create a soil carbon sponge right below the surface. With every 1% increase in organic matter, you get somewhere between 18 and 24,000 gallons increase in water holding capacity. We've increased our water holding capacity probably by about 30,000 gallons per acre, somewhere around there based off of our soil organic matter increase. And that increase came before we even got a crop. So the water is captured in the soil carbon and released slowly into the groundwater, whereas the other water cycle with bare ground, you're just losing most of that. The other thing I want to talk about are free nutrients. And this is something that I've learned from Dr. Christine Jones in Australia. And that is basically, we did a test here looking at total, it's a total nutrient test. And this shows basically what the level of nutrients are in your soil, not just what is available to a plant as determined by a lab. And the key to this is that the soil microbes can make a lot of this available. So if we have this pool of nutrients in our soil, how do we make that available and take advantage of that? And it really makes it apparent how crazy it is for a lot of the fertilizer inputs. And so this is based off of getting 5 tons of yield, how much we would be pulling off of our soils. This is the level that we have in pounds per acre of these various nutrients. And this is the year's supply that we would have of these. And these are some pretty astounding numbers, and I think it's really important for us to pay attention to this. The idea is not to mine all these, even if it takes 100,000 years or whatever. But right now we have a huge problem in that we don't cycle nutrients. We don't cycle all of our human waste. So this gives us a little time to figure this out, but we really need to work on this. This is another indication of that timeline. We've got 2,500 years of nitrogen, close to 3,000 of potassium, over 3,000 on phosphorus, calcium 15,000, copper 35,000. So it's just really amazing when you look at, and this is in, I believe this is in the top, a little over the top 2 feet of your soil. So those are phenomenal. We have phenomenal pools of resources underneath us. And the key to taking advantage of these is our microbes. And I think that the talk after mine is going to be discussing some of those microbes. Again, here's some others of those nutrients. Looks like we don't have to worry about iron for a long time. One of the ways that we, again, build ecosystem health and mimic nature is by looking at how nature functions. And one of the ways that nature builds and cycles soils is through grazing animals. And in general, they're managed very differently than humans tend to in their native setting. They tend to be in large herds, they move frequently, and they don't return into an area until after it's recovered because they're fouling it, they're dunging and urinating, so they don't want to come back for a while. This is one of the ways that the Great Plains became one of the most fertile regions in the world. And that is also one of the first things that was removed when the first white settlers came into Americas. So we take advantage of this by using livestock, and vineyards and sheep are one of the prime forms of livestock that we've found to be beneficial. And then we're using human creativity. We're looking at not just current methods, but what people have been doing in the past, what indigenous people have been doing, what farmers were doing before they had fossil fuel and chemicals and things like that. So there's a background of knowledge in this realm. One of the reasons to look at incorporating livestock is the effect that they do have on soil. And this is a great study that was done by the NRCS. It was either in North or South Dakota. There's a video on YouTube of this study where they took soil core samples. So they used a device that is able to go into the soil. It pulls out a core of soil, and then they laid it out on a sheet to see what the texture looked like. These were all taken from 200 feet of each other. It's the same soil type, just under different management. The first one on the left there is well-managed grassland, which means they're basically mimicking the way bison used to graze on those prairies, but they were using cattle. So the cattle were grazing in a high density group that was there for a short period of time. The grass and the soils were allowed to recover before coming back on. Probably only 50% or more of the grass was taken during any one grazing. The next slide shows, again, the same soil with season-long grazing. So the cattle were probably put in there in smaller numbers, but they were left there throughout the year. And the last one, had just been converted the year before into a no-till system. And so it was probably sprayed with an herbicide and then planted into, I imagine, either corn or soybeans. You can see the soil structure is really different between those. And even poor management with livestock with the season-long grazing still has better soil structure than the converted cropland. So I was thinking in that regards to how we manage most of our vineyards, and it's basically like that converted cropland, except that we are doing tillage in there. The interesting thing they did after this is they did a water infiltration test for that converted cropland. It took the equivalent of 1 inch of water, what would be the equivalent of 1 inch of rainwater, 31 minutes to infiltrate. So if you had a rain that lasted 15 minutes, half of that would flow off of a rainfall event of 1 inch. On the continuous season long grazing, it took 7.3 minutes for that water to infiltrate. On the well-managed grassland, it took 10 seconds. When I ask myself, what soil do I want? What type of water infiltration do I want? What habitat for microorganisms do I want? What system is going to build carbon better? Because there's a relationship, a positive relationship between water retention and carbon development in soils. Then it's obviously going to be by having well-managed livestock and that. The question then is, how do we do that in our vineyards? This is a photo from Gabe Brown, who's a pretty famous regenerative agriculture person. He's been at this for a while. This is a timeline of the various practices that he's done, from no-till to increasing crop diversity, to using cover crops, and then ultimately to going into multi-species cover crops, and then finally into grazing. And his soil organic matter really just shot up once he started combining both the multi-species grazing and the multi-species cover crops and the grazing. Actually, there is something called multi-species grazing, and I think actually Gabe is starting to do that now as well. So here's our problem in vineyards. I've worked in vineyards and designed vineyards in both California and Mediterranean climates, or other Mediterranean climates, and in the Southwest. The first two vineyards I designed, and the first vineyard I managed was in Arizona. We have the same problem in both places. Basically, the box, the kind of brown box, is denoting when we need to keep sheep out of vineyards because they graze the vines. The blue curve is denoting the growing season of the grapevines, so that's when we need to keep them out. And then the green hump is showing the growing seasons. And it's kind of similar in both areas, in that we miss the opportunity to take most of that energy and cycle it back into the soils because we have to keep the sheep out of the vineyard. So the question for me became then, how do we make this happen in vineyards? I did a trial in the Alexander Valley, setting up a simple offset system that's electrified, that would enable sheep to graze in the vineyard at any time of the year by keeping that wire electrified and positioning it right below the fruiting zone. This trial was conducted, it was a small plot right next to it was taken out of a 60-acre vineyard. And the other side was managed conventionally. I'd been managing the control site organically and biodynamically for a couple of years, just using sheep during the dormant season of the vines, and introduced the sheep. And so here's a few things that they do. For one thing, we never had to mow, we never had to weed eat, we never had to do any undervine cultivation. The control site, you can see there, the suckers are pretty big. There's a number of weeds and things growing in there. Those weeds, by the way, are perpetuated by tillage. Most weeds are low successional plants that take advantage of disturbed soil. In the trial site, the sheep took care of all the weeds. Generally, when you put sheep in a vineyard, the first thing they will eat are the weeds, what we consider weeds. The great thing about having them eat the suckers is grazing animals do impart disease and pest resistance to the plants that they browse off of or graze off of. So I actually want sheep in contact with the vines just at those points where it's beneficial to us and doesn't damage the fruit or the growing conditions of the vine. We went kind of late into the season, and we deprived the sheep of feed, and we're able to see that even turning the system off for a few days, they respected it. So it's pretty easy to train sheep to systems like this. When I talk about grazing proper grazing, what I'm referring to is this idea of again, mimicking nature. And most of this work has come from two people. One is Andrew Voisin, who's a French scientist, and the other is Alan Savory, who has updated Voisin's work and taken it all over the world. This picture would be looking at a vineyard overhead. And on the left side is the way that, that I like to graze vineyards. And on the right side is the way that a lot of well, especially rangeland is grazed. Most people do a pretty good job of grazing vineyards because they understand this concept. And that is, those little brown dots are supposed to be sheep as opposed to sheep turds. And the idea is that you keep them bunched together, you graze them fairly quickly, and then you move them onto the area that's been rested so that that has recovered and the grass is tall again, the grass or the forbs, and they graze that down again. That concentrates the dung and especially the urine. The urine is the most nutrient-rich part of what comes out of an animal. And so if you scatter the animals, you tend to have both overgrazing and compaction and overrest on the same land, and you don't get the utilization that you do by keeping them grouped tightly. You also get more productivity and you get more carbon sequestration out of using proper grazing. This is an example of improper grazing. This is from Sonoma County, and they had some baby doll sheep in here. They left them in this area throughout the season, and they grazed things down to the ground. Just outside of this area where there was cover crop that hadn't been grazed, it was up above the vines. And so I'm not sure why this occurred, but there was a big rainfall event after this, and they had a lot of erosion. This is actually a fairly steep hillside. So again, just using animals is not enough. You have to mimic the way that animals properly graze in natural systems. After doing that trial, these are the benefits that we realized. We eliminated the need for all mechanical or hand cultivation, tillage, and because it was organic, we didn't use herbicides, although there are now herbicides available for organic practices. Both between rows and under the vines, we eliminated approximately 10 to 20 tractor passes. Compaction is a huge issue in all of farming, and we're just starting to realize how big an issue it is. And the more tractor passes we can reduce, the better off we're going to be. Eliminated the need for all hand suckering. You can also do that somewhat with machines now. And it converted those suckers into fertilizer. So those suckers are no longer a problem for us, as our weeds are no longer a problem for us. They're a resource. So we're taking advantage of that solar energy collected into those plants or plant parts and using that to enhance the fertility. We got a reduction in irrigation use, 80% over the organic practices that we were using in the previous years, and 90% compared to the conventional control site. We also got an increase in the average yield by about 1,200 pounds per acre. And according to the winemaker, the quality was had improved as well. So we reduced the need to haul in outside sources of fertilizer and other elements into the vineyard, compost and things like that. Cost savings averaged then $450 to $500 an acre a year. That was in 2011. At that time, I think someone had asked what the cost savings were of sheep. At that time, I did presentations in Australia and did the numbers for here too. And in both Australia, New Zealand, and here, we're averaging about $100 per acre in savings doing dormant season grazing of vineyards. So getting your grazing into the growing season of the vines increases the economic benefits considerably.
Kelly, you have 4 minutes left.
Okay, the first commercial vineyard to adopt the system was in Australia. What we're doing now is an overhead system, and I'm going to skip how we developed that, but basically we used livestock and increasing and over a period of several years, dramatically increase the carrying capacity of that land. This was the final year before planting. We have developed a system now that allows us to graze sheep throughout the year without having to use the electrified deterrent system. It's an overhead system. We've gotten increases in our soil organic carbon that have been fairly substantial based on work that we've been doing and that UC Davis has done and Point Blue Conservation. So just about every place we're testing, the carbon is going up and sometimes significantly. We're also getting increases in nutrients that we've not added through fertilizer. They're just going up, which means that we're increasing our microbial community. And that's just basically showing that organic matter is going up, so sodium is going down, salinity is going down. One thing we haven't dealt with is, or are having trouble dealing with, is the boron is increasing because we have high boron in our irrigation water. This is what it looks like grazing during the growing season. We had some rams in there for the first time last year. The first thing they eat are the weeds. You can see this bare spot in front and behind the quad there. We didn't graze the area in between because we had some small vines, so we didn't want them to mess with those. They do a great job. And our system is, we have access both ways because it's overhead. You can drive a quad under there. We've increased our biodiversity considerably, and including things like snakes, and keeping the ground covered throughout the year. And this is the last time we grazed in the fall. And so having the system allows us to graze at any time of the year. And this year will be the first year we're able to do that through a significant portion of the vineyard because the vines will be tall enough. From that new design, these are the takeaways that we expect. We'll again replace the need for any hand, machine, chemical, weeding, suckering. We've eliminated, we've never done any tillage except at the initial development. We won't have to do any mowing. We'll reduce the need for offsite fertility. In fact, we will probably need to be careful about building fertility too much, and continue to increase the holding capacity of our soils, water holding, and maintain resilience to climate change. Increase our diversity and increase our profitability because sheep are also a profit center for us. With that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was a very interesting perspective on how agricultural systems can benefit from mimicking natural ecosystems. Up next, we're going to have Anya assist us with the Q&A. And right after that, we're going to have a 10-minute break. So please stay with us. Anya, can you please take it away?
Absolutely. Thanks for all the great questions here. Kelly, I'm going to start it off with, should be a pretty quick one. Are you able to mechanically harvest at Piscines Ranch with the electrified sheep wire at the cordon?
So we actually don't have electrified wire at the cordon, and we're using a divided high trellis system, which can be machine harvested. I don't know if anybody who's using this system, there's several people in California and in Australia who are using this now. I don't know if any of them have mechanically harvested, but I'm sure that it could be set up so that you could mechanically harvest.
All right. I think you touched a little bit on kind of keeping a close eye on nutrients and added nutrition, but do the grazing practices allow you to eliminate the need for compost, or is it just a reduced application?
Yeah, we use compost initially, and after that, we will not be using any compost. So we used 4 tons per acre after we had cleared the land for farming. So that was just to try and jumpstart the fact that we had cleared the land. So our intention is that we will not need any compost.
Great. And how do you contain the sheep to the grazing zone you're targeting? And I guess as an add-on to that, how do you do the sheep ever get out of the fenced area?
To answer the first question or the second question first, yes, they occasionally do get out, but it's actually not that big of a problem for us because they're in a much, the 25-acre vineyard is in a larger 200-acre paddock that is fenced. We use 2 wires, 2 electric wires, a poly wire, very easy to set up and take down. We also custom graze Calera Vineyard, which is a neighbor of ours, and so we do the same thing there. That's just grazed during the dormant season. So two poly wire solar charger.
Great. And a question about the grape yield increase you mentioned. So could you please clarify the increase of yield by 1,200 pounds per acre? How many annual grazing season passes were required before you saw the response in the vines? And was this vineyard where the grazing was done during dormant season or during the growing season as well?
Okay, for the trial that was done in the Alexander Valley, that increase in yield occurred after the first year of doing extended season grazing. So we grazed from probably the end of January until the end of June. And again, that was grazed periodically. So there weren't sheep in every paddock the whole time. They were bunched up and moved through there. So that increase in yield occurred that first year that we had the sheep in there. And that was surprising, as was the decrease in water use. So.
All right. And how about, could you speak more to the stocking rates per acre and how long the sheep are in that area, or is it variable?
Yep, it is variable depending on the year, and how much, which dictates how much forage is growing in your cover crop. But I would say a general ballpark figure that I use is about 200 sheep per acre. And they may be in there for anywhere from 1 to up to 6 days, depending on how much forage.
Okay. And let's see, speaking of forage, do you have to supplement feed for the sheep, or do they sustain themselves on whatever's growing?
Ironically, sometimes when the feed is growing best, we do have to supplement them with dry feed. We might have to throw a little dry straw on there or something. Otherwise, they're just getting too much green matter, and they need a little bit of dry matter. If they don't get that, sometimes they'll start chewing on the vines a little bit. So,
interesting. And let's see. I'm sorry if I missed this one you mentioned, but what do you have growing under the vines and between the rows? Can you touch a little bit on the cover that you have?
Yep, we've been using a cover crop of oats, triticale, barley, lana vetch, crimson clover, California poppy, phacelia, daikon radish, and increasingly we are moving towards less of those types of cover crops and more native plants. So we're starting to plant more of the native, especially pollinator plants that are growing around here, in order to increase insect diversity and benefits to the insect population. So one of the things we're worried about, if continuing with the cover crops that we have been using, is again that idea of being too much productivity.
All right, and let's see, I've got another question. So 200 sheep sounds like a lot to manage. Can you do it with less, or how few is the lower range of that?
No, you could do it with 1 sheep. It depends on your size. You get the vineyard that we're grazing is 25 acres, and so we have the ability, if we wanted to put 1,000 sheep in there. Obviously, it's the amount of sheep relates to how long they're there. And if you have less sheep and you're in a larger area, then you're going to have to stay there for a little bit longer, in which case you're getting compaction and possibly overgrazing. So it's a kind of a mathematical formula between time and amount of forage and number of sheep. And if anybody is interested in learning more about that, I suggest they read Alan Savory, or there's a number of books on planned grazing out now that are helpful in learning those formulations.
All right, maybe you could throw in some suggested reading into our chat window for folks.
Okay.
So you had mentioned, you highlighted that picture of the baby doll sheep that kind of created a little bit too much activity in the Sonoma vineyard. Are there ever instances where those sheep would work year round, or is year round just not a great idea because of the impacts?
Right. So I refer to it as extended season grazing in vineyards, which means that you can take the planned grazing where you keep them bunched up and moved frequently, you just extend that out into the growing season of the vines, as long as you have something to eat. What you don't want to do is have a small or a large group of animals in a vineyard. And for instance, you could supplement feed them if you don't have enough feed in there. You're going to be creating compaction and probably high nitrogen levels, and probably not very happy sheep and bare ground. So so really what you want to do, no matter what quantity of animals you have, is keep them moving and allow both soils and plants to rest. And usually a minimum recovery period is about 30 days. And that's during fast growth.
All right, and I think we probably only have a chance for 1 or 2 questions. Circling back to the grape yields, we have another question of what is the grape yield on average for mature vineyards at Piscines under these practices? Curious about the short-term profitability of the system, understanding that the system has a much longer profitability viewpoint at the end, which at the end of the day is important.
So that's a great question, and I wish I had the answer to that, but this will be our first year of a commercial crop at Piscines. So we will have a better idea going forward after this year what our yield is. Our spacing is 12 by 6, but our training system increases the productivity per vine than over like a conventional VSP. So according to the consultant who's been working with us on this, he is expecting we should get about 5 tons to the acre.
Great, thank you. And maybe, let's see if we can squeeze in 2 more. How do you approach sulfur spray passes when you have sheep in the vineyard?
You have to plan around that. So if you don't have a place to move the sheep out when you're doing a spray, then you shouldn't have sheep in there. But we are going to try and transition to a completely biological approach to powdery mildew this year. We'll see how that works. Previously, we have been using sulfur and oil and serenade, a few things like that. And so we have plenty of room to move the sheep out when we're spraying, and we'll leave them out for a while then, and then put them back after that.
Okay. All right, and one last one. Is there a difference in sheep versus goat grazing in vineyards?
Very different. Goats look up to graze. Sheep kind of look across, and cattle look down. So when a goat grazes, it wants to eat leaves off of trees or bushes and things like that. So goats, I would be really careful with goats. Maybe Nigerian dwarf or something like that might work, but sheep will browse the grapevines, but a goat will definitely take it down. So goats, I would be very careful with, and I personally think sheep are really ideal, and especially hair sheep, to graze and browse in the vineyard.
All right. Well, I think that, that about cuts us out of our Q&A. So I will pass it back to Miguel to close us out for our break. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you.